Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Luke Klipp, and I'm Education Director for Abundant Housing Los Angeles, or Abundant Housing LA. I've been doing this for about a year, and the presentation we're going to walk through today is something that I've developed for Abundant Housing LA, and is something that also I've been modifying, adjusting as I give these presentations and get feedback from folks, and really am trying to make this as useful and helpful presentation as possible for you. I want to thank you all for joining us via Zoom. This is, as I'm sure we're all experiencing, a whole new experience, a whole new world for us right now. And I'm mindful that the presentation we're about to go through here was developed in a very different context, right? Everything is sort of a very different world. Understanding that there's a lot of sort of perspectives in the world that have shifted very quickly. A lot of things we understand about how things operate that we're still trying to sort of sort through in this moment in time. And I'm happy to entertain questions around that at any point, and really want to make sure that this is something that all of you who are here today are able to get something out of. That said, I also would just note, I invite you to ask questions about anything around this presentation as we go through it. I've got the chat window open. So if you have any questions as we go through this, please ask them. We have a couple hours here in the agenda. Probably won't need more than half that to actually go through the PowerPoint itself. So there's plenty of time built in here for us to ask questions, and I invite you to please do that. I'm happy to be to sort of just stop and go through anything in more detail. So that said, let's dive in just a little bit here. Let's see here. I gotta figure this out. Here we go. Okay. So this is what we'll cover today. We're gonna start with just sort of the general theory of change that we have at Abundant Housing LA. Moving on then to giving some context for the LA region, which is very unique. It's very large, very complex. And that's something we have to really consider in our work. And then we'll talk some about the history of housing in our region, and then dive in a little on some policy approaches that we can employ to address the housing challenges we face, and then ways that you can get involved. And before we sort of do all that, I just want to say a couple of quick words about myself. Now, if we were doing this in person, I would invite everyone to sort of share very quickly a little bit of your story as to why you're here. And unfortunately, that's just not available to us at this point, but please please reflect on that and think about that, and let that inform any questions or comments that you have today. For myself, this is a picture of St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin, which is an old shipping town just across from Duluth, Minnesota, at the western end of Lake Superior. And St. Joe was shuttered back in the 70s, and my family actually lived in St. Joseph's for a couple years when it was an abandoned hospital. And I say that just because, I have a lot of privilege. I have a lot and have had a lot of opportunities available to me, and continue to, on account of things that are just part of my identity. But I've also experienced housing insecurity, and this in other contexts, not just this, where for my family, we had difficult choices at many points along the way, and I think frankly that's part of the reason this is very personal. While I'm very fortunate to have a roof over my head right now, and have lots of opportunities available to me, I also recognize that that wasn't always the case, and for many people that is not the case. And so housing is just one of those things that, we hear the phrase housing is a human right. We do find that access to housing is one of the key indicators of people's ability to succeed, to access, any number of other things in their lives. Unironically, I suppose, in some ways, housing has been demonstrated as the most cost-effective way to address homelessness, is to get people into housing. And you would think, oh, well, that seems obvious, but a lot of times our focus around addressing homelessness has been around services and getting people into care and service. But actually, for most, it's just getting them into a home. So for me, I offer that context because I think it's, we talk a lot about housing in numbers and data and statistics, but it's also really important to personalize it and understand for each of us why this is such an important topic. So let's just dive in. Our theory of change and why do we care at Abundant Housing LA. This is a photo of just someone's front yard in Minneapolis, which is not an uncommon sight where you have someone offering a sign that says, everyone's welcome, and this is actually something that sort of took off more in the last 3 years or so. I think a lot of consternation and a lot of more progressive communities about feeling like they don't really recognize a lot of what's happening right now in the country. But then also right next to that, this, don't change anything. So it's this sort of, for many people, these things actually fit. But when you think about the housing context, a lot of times it's communities where they were built 50 to 80 years ago, a lot of single family homes that, were affordable at one time and are now no longer. And it's lovely as liberally minded folks to say everyone's welcome here, but then when some of this is, okay, great, more housing so that everyone can be welcome here, and people say, oh no, don't do that. So that's just to sort of offer a little bit of sort of, where these things get inordinately complicated. Sort of the national picks around stuff doesn't necessarily translate to when we look at these things locally. But our theory of change at Abundant Housing LA has 3 key components to it. The first is that we want to make sure that everyone can afford a home. Period, end of story. Everyone should be able to have a home they can afford. One of the things you might hear in local discussions of housing is, well, if you want to be able to have a home you can afford, go live or fill in the blank somewhere else, somewhere that's not the place where someone has, offered that they want to be able to build more housing. And, there's sort of this sense of, well, the affordable housing's over yonder. And the reality is nowhere if we're not just building housing everywhere. So for us at Abundant Housing LA, it's about abundant housing wherever and everywhere, and not just sort of limiting it to these small little areas, which we'll see through this presentation have increasingly gotten smaller and smaller, where we allow abundant housing to get built. Our second part of our theory of change is making communities more livable and sustainable. The kinds of housing that we at Abundant Housing LA really advocate are more livable and sustainable, period, end of story. I think in the context of this current public health crisis, there's been a lot of discussion around density. And for better or worse, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has used the word density a lot in criticizing the state's ability to address the public health crisis. But some of the most dense populations on the planet have done the best work in addressing this crisis most rapidly. It's really not the density, it's the dedication. It's the ability to dedicate resources to something. And frankly, wherever you have people gathering, which by the way is everywhere, it doesn't matter if they live 50 people to an acre or 2 people to an acre, they're gonna go to church, they're gonna go to the grocery store, they're gonna go to work, they're gonna go to school. Wherever you have people gathering, something like COVID is gonna happen. But for us, from a perspective around sort of writ large, the livability and sustainability of communities, what we're advocating is that they should be more livable and sustainable with more housing being created in an urban environment. And third and finally, and we'll dive a little more into this, but addressing the urgent climate crisis, because yes, COVID-19 is very urgent, but oh, by the way, it's kind of a bit of a warm-up for what we're seeing in terms of the climate. Not many people have noticed this because we've had lots of other things in the headlines, but the last couple of months have been some of the warmest in the planet's recorded history. And that's just on top of beating the previous months, which beat the previous months. We're just sort of seeing this snowballing effect of our climate. And frankly, one of the only ways we can truly meaningfully address that is by providing people the ability to live in communities where they don't have to drive for everything. So in terms of the theory of change, on the first one about make sure everyone has a home that they can afford, California Legislative Analyst's Office did a report several years ago. The LAO, I will just note, is one of the most boring offices, and I say this sincerely and kindly. They're incredibly boring because they don't have a political agenda. They're not trying to drive any kind of dialogue or conversation. They just say, oh, here's a topic, let's look at it. And then they research it. And then they say, here's what we found. And what they found was building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. This may seem like a fairly basic concept to folks, but what they're essentially saying is if you don't build enough housing for the people who want the housing prices go up, which a lot of people say, duh, it's supply and demand. But frankly, I think in a lot of our discussions around housing in a local context, this is something that kind of really gets lost because people will say, well, if you build more of this housing, it's going to attract a certain kind of population and blah, blah, blah. The LAO actually said, no, that's not the case. We can even look at a lower, at a more fine-grained detail in their analysis, and they found that it didn't matter if it was market or affordable or whatever the case may be. Building less housing costs, building more housing makes housing more affordable. They did, however, note that affordable housing programs have a role as a supplement to broader changes to facilitate private housing construction. So when we talk about, inclusionary zoning, designated affordable housing, designated extremely low income, whatever, they said that these programs have a role, but as a supplement, not as the only program that we have to create more housing. And then they, sort of big overarching that policies need to be changed to allow more private housing construction in coastal urban areas. There's a lot of, California, when we talk about the sort of political landscape in California, it's often sort of this idea of Northern California versus Southern California. But really in California, it's coastal urban California versus rural inland California. And rural inland often doesn't have access to the same kinds of resources, is much poorer, frankly. And then coastal urban is very wealthy, very high housing demand costs, and it's this big divide for the state. So for abundant housing LA, we look at this and say, yep, in order for people to have a home they can afford, we have to build more housing. So then in terms of our second theory of change, making communities more livable and sustainable, this is a study that was done several years back, looking at cost per household in a suburban and an urban environment. This was done in Canada, but this is actually something that holds basically anywhere. And it doesn't take, you don't have to think a lot about it to understand what they're demonstrating, which is that basically when you have more land, more space consumed per household in a suburban environment, all of these costs that are associated with that particular household are this much more than if it's in a household that's occupying less land, less space in an urban environment. So you can, the obvious one is roads. Roads are 10 times as expensive in a suburban environment as they are in an urban environment because you just need a lot more roads to transport the same number of people. That's all there is to it. But then things you might not necessarily think of, like libraries. You might necessarily think, why would libraries be more expensive? But the reality is you've got to transport your books further between libraries. You've got to think about where you're going to get your staff for your libraries. They're further apart, so that there's all sorts of things that happen in a suburban context that make communities harder to be sustainable over the long run and harder to be livable. And this is just sort of driving the point home a little bit further. A story that was in the Winnipeg Free Press, again, Canada. Oddly, this is stuff I can find much more easily to share with y'all from Canada than from the United States, but here it is, which just basically said, look, we're growing, but we're growing wider in terms of our land than in terms of our population. So we're seeing, the population is whatever it is, essentially relatively unchanged, but the land is significantly more. So that means you have to push water further out for people to have drinking water. You're having to put sewer services further out for the same numbers of people. So it's a lot of incredible amounts of capital costs, operating maintenance costs, et cetera. So that's for us why we really want to drive home the point as our second point of our theory of change, that we want communities to be livable and sustainable. I won't go into climate change as much. I mean, this may be fairly self-explanatory, but one thing I would just note, we talk a lot about, and I'm going to black out the screen here for just a moment. We talk a lot about, how driving is has such an impact on our built environment, on our air environment. And frankly, one of the things I think that is fascinating in this whole COVID-19 crisis is we're seeing how rapidly things could change in terms of our air quality. And you think about Los Angeles is notorious for having the worst air quality of any metropolitan area in the entire United States. Not across the world, because we've been beat by a lot of other nations in that category. But in the United States, we're consistently the worst air quality. But in the last couple of weeks, we've had consistently the best or second or third best air quality of any major metropolitan region on the planet. And that's happened in just a couple of weeks. Now, granted, this is not a sustainable, what we're in right now is not a sustainable environment, because we're seeing people just being forced out of jobs, having their work hours cut to the point where they're not able to afford their homes. So let's be real. This is not the kind of thing where we can say, yeah, let's just do this. But it is also giving us some insight and a window into how quickly and how responsive our environment is to the choices we make every single day. And so, when we think about having, if a politician had told you 3 months ago, in April, we're going to have the best air quality in LA on the planet, you would have laughed him out of the room. And you would have been right to do that, because we've known for decades we have absolutely the worst air quality in the country and some of the worst on the planet. So why would we think in just a matter of months that we would have the best? But the reality for us is that all of these individual choices aggregate up. And if we really want to affect meaningful, broad change, part of that has to be giving people the ability to live in a way that doesn't require them to have to use their cars for every single thing that they do. And we're seeing the very real effect of that. And frankly, climate change is going to be the big thing for us. It already is in many ways, in many communities that are feeling the impact right now. But for us, it's going to be that thing that we could learn some things from what we're going through right now and try and start to apply those in terms of how we look at policy changes going forward to really enable our housing discussion to be geared toward addressing big systemic issues like climate change. And by the way, I have not seen any questions in the chat, but if any of you have questions, feel free to ask at any point. So I'll move on to our next section, which is a little bit about our region, giving y'all some context here. So I'm offering just a little meme to kick us into each one of these sections here, and little office humor here. So LA County, we're that little red spot on the map of the United States here in the lower left-hand corner that I've circled for you in case you don't actually know where we are in the United States. But LA County has a population of just north of 10 million residents, which if we were an individual state would make us the 8th largest state by population. All of the states you see on this map in blue, each one of them has fewer residents than we have in LA County. So when you think about states like Washington or Georgia or Michigan or Colorado or Arizona, each one of those states has fewer residents than we have just in LA County. And I also note here that if you combine the 10 smallest states' populations, it would still be fewer people than in LA County. So we got a lot of people here. And I offer that because, we talk a lot about LA County is big and there's a lot of different cities and communities, but what does that really mean? And what that really means is, when you, like, for instance, we have voting in elections, 10 states have way more power than we even have just within our little share of California here in LA County. So this is some measure to show you how we subdivide our LA County area. The first one in the upper left-hand corner is our congressional districts. And then in the middle top, you see the 15 city council districts for the city of LA City Council. The upper right is the other 87, not all of them because they don't all fit on this map, but the other 87 cities in LA County. There's 88 cities in LA County. Each one of them has their own city council and their own mayor. Most of these cities have city council districts that are individual districts and not just citywide elections for their city council. So you can imagine if each one of these cities has a city council of, let's say, 9 people, just by cities in LA County, you've already got over 700 elected officials. Then on the lower right-hand side, we have our state senate districts. In the lower left-hand side are 5 LA County supervisorial districts. LA County's supervisors each represent 2 million residents in the county. And if you don't know who your county supervisor is, it's a good idea to find out who that is. They don't do as much in terms of housing broadly, but they do for the 1 million LA County residents who live in unincorporated LA County. So you look at that map of the cities in the upper right-hand side, you see a lot of white area, and that's mostly the city of LA. But there's other areas, including specifically like East LA, that are, as well as Westchester, that are unincorporated. They're not incorporated into a city. So their elected official, almost in every case, just one person, is that county supervisor who overall represents 2 million people, but has some of them who have no city that they can go to talk to about their issues with sanitation, police, fire, planning, whatever the case may be. So it's part of the thing that I want you to sort of take away from looking at this is functionally, we are ungovernable. We are an ungovernable region. Who's the person who's responsible for housing policy in this region? Who's the person? There is none. There's no person who could say, here's how we're going to do housing in the LA region. And part of what, for me, I take away from this is why it's so important for the state to really kind of step in and say, here are our state parameters, because ultimately what ends up happening is individual cities sort of compete with each other and compete against each other for this or that thing. And a thing that they most crave from a municipal level, and I say this as someone who in my day job works in the city government, the thing they most crave are sales tax dollars. So they want commercial business. So that's why, like in Glendale, you have Auto Row, and you've got Glendale Boulevard loaded with auto dealerships, because those are big money for a city. The thing that they don't get a lot of money out of, housing. So when you consider the amount of political machinations involved just to build new housing, the amount of fights that happen in communities, within governments, with various with various entities outside of government just to get housing, which from a city perspective is not particularly financially great because it doesn't generate a lot of money relative to, let's say, commercial or business. It is less desirable. Now, I'm not going to say that they're going to want to oppose housing for that region, but the incentives are not there as they might be for commercial development. So someone just asked, are cities not profiting much off of property tax dollars? Cities do get property tax dollars, 100%. But they get property tax dollars if it's commercial or if it's housing, right? Housing doesn't generate sales tax dollars. So, you know, there is definitely an incentive for business. Business generates jobs. Jobs, by the way, have their own taxes. So I don't want to sit here and say governments don't want housing, but the financial incentives are different. So all of that to say, we have a very complex region on a very complicated issue. And where that drives me personally is there's a very big role here for the state to step in and say, here are the standards you need to establish so that all cities are playing from the same playbook. So a little bit then about our housing history here in LA. And I offer the question here, what's up with zoning? And not to offer a meme this go round, but here we are anyway. Tell me about we preserving neighborhood character. We don't necessarily hear the context of what that neighborhood character means, but we do hear that people will say, well, you know, we have to preserve our neighborhood. And frankly, for us at Abundant Housing LA, let's look at more about enhancing neighborhood character, because from my perspective, neighborhood character is not about the buildings, it's about the people. And we should make it more possible for the people to have a successful ability to, or the ability to be successful in whatever pursuits they take on, and not just about having that perfect, you know, architectural flair on this or that building. But that's just me. So this is Wilshire Boulevard in West LA, near UCLA. It's a community that is known to some as Condo Canyon. And those tall buildings you see along Wilshire Boulevard contrast quite a bit with the homes that are directly north and south of them in what is essentially all one community. But directly along Wilshire Boulevard, we allow much taller buildings. And then just off it, we allow one home per property. So I offer this because this is really zoning very visibly presented, because the only difference between the planned that allows that building with homes on it versus the one directly adjacent that allows only one is that the property that allows a lot more homes allows all of those people to pool their money to buy a piece of that. The property that only allows one home only allows one family, one household to use their money to buy that. The difference in price between those two pieces of land, if there was not zoning, would be essentially the same. It would essentially be the amenities, the access, the location, mobility, climate, whatever you think about it, they're all essentially the same. If anything, the property that's directly just off of Wilshire, that's a couple doors down, might actually be a little more valuable because it's not as impacted by street noise. So what you have here is zoning really determining where people can live on this corridor. That Condo Canyon, each one of those buildings will hold far more people than the entire rest of the block of single family homes. So this is an example very visibly. You can see this when you fly in or out of LAX. You can see it when you take the bus up Wilshire, or you drive, or however you go. It's very clear. And this map is the city of LA. This is something that the New York Times put together last year, where they looked at a number of cities across the country around the question of zoning. And there's two colors here, pink and blue. Both of these colors are on all of the parcels in the city of LA that are zoned for housing. And everything that is pink is zoned for single family only. Everything that is blue allows multifamily. And multifamily means one thing. It means that more than one household can live on a single piece of land. That's all it means. Multifamily means more than one household can live on a single piece of land. Single family housing means only one household can live on this piece of land. Doesn't matter how big the piece of land. It just means only one household can live on that piece of land. So in the city of LA, and all the land we have zoned for housing, 75% is zoned for single family housing. Now you'll notice on the map that you can see the streets fairly clearly on here. There are areas like in downtown, in Hollywood, where it kind of grays out a little bit because that's actually zoned for more than just housing. And we actually can build housing there. And that's actually some of the only communities where we're building the most housing right now in LA are areas that are not zoned only for housing. And that might tell you a little something about how we're doing housing in the city of LA right now. That's city of LA specifically. This slide is just to sort of give you a little bit of context of construction of history, or excuse me, the construction of housing in LA. And I couldn't find a chart that went all the way from 1920 to 2020. Hold on just a second, got a question here and I just wanna, we'll get to that, Jeremy, thank you. That's a good question. I actually have a slide on that. So this housing, this chart shows, these two charts, I try to kind of scale them so you could see them along the same lines, so the 30,000 lines around the same spot across the page. But the first chart's from a newspaper from early 1940s showing housing units constructed from 1921 to 42. And the second one is from 1980 to 2000. I can't quite see it on my screen here, but I believe it's 2008, yes. So in the first chart, you're seeing single family homes in the black bars, duplexes in the white bars, and multifamily in the dash bars. In the city of LA now, for all intents and purposes, well, prior to some state law changes the last few years, anything not the black bar would have been considered multifamily, and only single family could be built on single family zoned areas. Going to the right, you see this is done a little differently, but the single family is the black line along the bottom for every year, the number of units constructed, and multifamily in the gray line that jumps up and down. So I note this because if you look at the first chart in 1923, we built 43,000 some odd, almost 44,000 housing units in a single year. In 1923, that's 97 years ago, we built 44,000 homes in a single year. This past year, we built about, I want to say it was around 14,000 homes. And we'll dive into this a little bit more, but just to sort of give everyone a little bit of the context here. At that time in the 20s, we had a few 100,000 people living in the city of LA, and we were building homes at this pace. You can see obviously very clearly on the chart the Great Depression in the early 30s, and then the bounce back during the World War II era, which frankly LA has been consistently a military strategic location, and the aerospace industry. You can also see again in the 1980s chart when we were building up during the Cold War, and there was a lot of new housing that was getting built in the 80s, especially multifamily housing. Westchester was one area that saw a lot of that, just north of LAX. And then, surprise, surprise, city of LA decided, oh, no, we want to stop new multifamily housing. At the same time that some federal laws were changed, tax policy that then made it very unprofitable to build multifamily housing. And there was the floor fell out underneath the multifamily housing construction business. So we've had some boom and busts around this. You'll note that even though multifamily housing ticked up in the aughts, it's never really been at the level that we saw even back in the 20s, almost 100 years ago. So there's some reasons for this, but there's something else I want to just bring into this conversation. By the way, if anyone has any hard time hearing me, I saw that my internet connection is unstable. I want to make sure that if there's any issues, let me know. So this is a map that I'm guessing many of you have seen, but this is, or at least are familiar with the idea, but this is something called a redlining map. And every city in the country has one of these, or had one of these. For most cities, these were implemented in the mid-30s, and they were not illegal 30 years later. 30 years. So 30 years, these maps decided significantly how people were able to access housing. Now, you know, when I offer that, I want to emphasize that period of time for folks because, you know, I think a lot of times we sort of want to think about, well, redline was something that just sort of happened and then it went away and it wasn't around necessarily that long, but 30 years, I think for a lot of the folks who are in abundant housing LA at this point, 30 years is probably before, you probably aren't yet 30 years old. So like 30 years is a long time for a single set of policies to really decide who does and who does not have access to housing. And what these maps did was, so these were maps for the federal lending. So if you wanted to get a mortgage that was backed by the federal government, which were the most viable mortgages possible, you could only do that if you were trying to get a home in a green or blue area. Yellow, maybe. Red, no way. But green or blue, all right. Now, that's not to say you could not get a single family home with a mortgage of some sort in an area that was yellow or red on the map. It just wouldn't be backed by the feds. And that's significant because what that meant for a lot of communities is, especially lower income communities, communities of color, and we'll see a little bit in a moment why this was, or what this, you know, how these maps were devised. But what that meant was you could potentially get a loan to buy a home, but because it wasn't federally backed, it was riskier. And because it was riskier, it was more expensive. And so actually what ended up happening as a result of these policies for communities of color, lower income communities, you had to spend even more for the same homes that people who were whiter and wealthier were spending for homes in areas marked green or blue on the map. All right, hold on. Got another question here. It's a great question. Let's dive in a little bit here on this and let's see if your question still stands as we go through this. So there are two areas here I've circled, green and red. You can actually, you can Google Los Angeles redlining map and you can find these documents. What I'm about to share with you is something that's just publicly available, where you can see how they described every single one of these communities that are outlined in different colors, right? So every single one of these, I've just circled two of them, but every single, like they're broken down into basically census tracts and then colored, red, green, yellow, or blue, based on these characteristics. So I'm gonna highlight first this green one that's circled, which is like Runyon, is that Runyon Canyon area? I should know this, but I didn't. Yes, I believe it's Runyon Canyon area. And then the red one, which is Westlake MacArthur Park area. So here's the area description for the first one. This is a federal document to determine if this area qualifies for federal backing of mortgages. So this first one that was, and I'm going to go back and just show you, this is the area that's in the center top of the screen around Runyon Canyon. The description is that the population is moderately increasing. It's business and professional men, executives, motion picture stars, incomes of $3,600 and upward, and has 0% foreign families, no nationalities indicated on here, Negroes, 0%, and shifting or infiltration, none apparent or anticipated. This is a federal document that was the policy for 30 years. So that area, Westlake MacArthur Park, that I circled, had a slowly increasing population with skilled artisans, laborers, white collar, and works progress administration workers with incomes from $700 to $2,000, 20% foreign families, Japanese and Russians and some Mexicans in terms of the nationalities indicated on here, 10% Negro, and shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly, which is what they're saying here with this incredibly offensive language, is that the community is, in their minds, rapidly becoming more people who are of Japanese origin or African American. And this is a document that decided with these characteristics for that area in red, you could not get a federally backed mortgage for these reasons because of this description. So 30 years, this was the policy. And going back to that map, every area that you see in red, those descriptions apply. It was because there was a large percentage in the eyes of the federal loan administration. There was a large percentage of people of color. Areas that are yellow, still a relatively high percentage in their eyes. Green or blue, mostly white. And in their eyes, people with a lot of income, relatively speaking, and thus they felt like it was a safe bet for them. It was not a risky bet to provide federally backed mortgages. So Jeremy's question is about, did redlining affect rental housing? I think where we have to think about this is that someone still owns rental housing. So what it does is, if you can get a federally backed mortgage, you're more likely to be able to own your own home. If you can't, it's more likely in a community where there's going to be multiple families in a home. I'm sure I'm doing a good job describing this. But when you have communities where the feds have already identified you have lower incomes, you're much more likely to see people who are in rental housing anyway, because they're much less likely to be able to afford housing. And what the federal policy was doing with redlining was essentially sort of enshrining that, was sort of crystallizing that through a very race lens. Does that answer your question, Jeremy? Just go ahead and indicate one way or the other. Okay, great. Okay. All right, so just sort of driving these points home, redlining is in the mid-1930s. The first federal legislation saying stop redlining came about in 1968. Shortly thereafter, though, and I put this in here, you don't necessarily see this in the history of redlining, but shortly after redlining stopped, the federal government stopped building housing. So all this time, the federal government's been building housing. And you see a lot about like federal housing, and there's sort of notorious examples of this in various communities across the country and cities, but the federal government stopped building housing in the 70s. And I would just note here as well, there are still cases going on right now that address the ongoing and persistent effects of redlining and discrimination lending. This is not something that stopped in 1968. Furthermore, even where you don't have legit legal cases, I mean, in our region, by the way, there was just a case settled a couple ago around a city discriminating against people of color who were trying to rent housing in property in LA, not city of LA, but this LA region. These things are still happening. But I also note this because one of the things that doesn't get reported on as much in the national news around racial disparities, it does in some contexts, but we hear a lot about sort of income disparities, health access disparities, which we're obviously hearing a lot more about right now, but is wealth disparities. And what wealth is the amount of money that your household has been able to sort of accrue over time. It's not the income you have this year. It's the income that you've had for your life, plus whatever income that was given to you by whoever else was able to give you their income, et cetera, sort of compounded upon itself. And going back to my earlier point about if you were a person of color trying to buy a home in an area that the city had deemed yellow or red, or not the city, the feds had deemed yellow or red, you could still get a loan probably. It just wouldn't be federally backed. So you're going to spend more money on it. And what's that going to do if you're already having a harder time earning as much money as white people, and you're paying even more for the same house as a white person would? Your wealth, your ability to retain wealth over time is dramatically impacted relative to someone who may be of the exact same standing, but white. And so what we're now seeing, and there was an article in the LA Times, and I should pull it up and put it in this presentation at some point, but there was an article last year, I believe it was, maybe it was the year before, about how a lot of the new homeowners today, people purchasing homes today in our region, are children who are adults, but their parents are paying their down payments. And when you think about that, okay, it makes some sense in the context of it's so expensive to buy a home in LA, right? It's incredibly expensive. But then also think about, well, why do the parents have the money to make the down payment on the home? Well, because they've accrued the wealth that they've had handed to them. And who are those people most likely to be in a region that has this kind of housing context, right? So from our perspective about housing in LA, we share this, we talk about this, not to say that not building housing is some kind of racist thing, or when someone says preserve my neighborhood character, that makes them a racist. This is to say that our housing context is very, I want to use the media term, racially tinged, but actually very racist. And we need to be able to see that and understand it for what it is, and make that part of our intent to change that, right? That we're not saying, it's not me saying, we're at Abundant Housing LA, we're the anti-racists, but it is saying we don't want to perpetuate the racism that has so defined and shaped our region for so long. We are intent on doing what we can to change that, to break out of that. So, all right. So just a few other things I would note about redlining and its impacts today, right? So this there's an article came out last year that showed that redlining is still evident today. They looked at 108 urban areas nationwide. Areas that have been redlined neighborhoods are hotter by up to 13 degrees on a daily basis, and the annual average, than their green and blue adjacent communities. 13 degrees I mean, imagine in LA an 80-degree day, right? 80 degrees. In one community could be 93 versus another community it's 80. That has significant impacts on public health. We're seeing, and again, we're seeing this play out in this COVID-19 crisis, where some of the hardest hit communities across the country are our poorer communities, lower income communities, communities of color. This is not a surprise. This is unfortunately very much because you can figure out, you can see based on zip codes, people's the kinds of effects that they're going to have in their kinds of access to resources, the impacts on their health, and that is a historic legacy of redlining. We're living it right now. I also noted in here that, again, once an issue near and dear to my heart, street safety. It turns out that communities in redlined neighborhoods are much more at risk for impacts from traffic violence, getting hit by a car or whatever the case may be. So these are things that still play out today. I also just offer this to show some of the data that we have around homeownership by race and ethnicity. The thing that sort of sticks out for me in this is that homeownership generally kind of increased from the 60s to the to the early 2000s, right? Sort of, you can see the blue lines going up, the black line goes up kind of mostly, the yellow line goes up. So we're seeing this increase across the board. But then when the floor fell out of the economy in 2008, you can see one bar really goes down, and that's African-American home ownership. So this is still playing out. So I tie this in a little bit to sort of bringing this into present day. What happened after redlining ended, and what did we do after that? So in the mid-1960s, LA began a wholesale downzoning that we really pushed for essentially 20 to 30 years, where it was just like, well, this thing and this thing. If you're familiar with these topics, you've probably heard of parking requirements. You've probably heard of yards. People have yards. Well, why do we have yards? Yards are prescribed by feet, by setbacks, by widths. Things are very, very prescribed. You probably heard about density limits. Obviously, I've mentioned single family zoning. So these are all things that LA has implemented over the years. And actually, where I live in Los Feliz, which is just north of Silver Lake, just south of Griffith Park, in our community, something like 60 to 70% of the housing we have today would be illegal to build under our current zoning, because it was built back in the 20s and 30s, primarily, when a lot of this multifamily housing was allowed, and then we subsequently downzoned it. So when people come to a community meeting and say, we need more housing like what we have today, or like what we have, existing in our community now, that's our neighborhood character, it's important for them to, yeah, except it's no longer legal to build it. We've literally made it illegal through all of these different things. And frankly, I also offer this list of things here because it sounds like technical jargon and verbiage. These are things that have very impassioned folks behind them. People who will say, don't undermine my sunshine. Don't put all these cars out on the street if you don't have enough parking, blah, blah, blah. But they're not just some technical thing. They actually have very real impacts on people's ability to afford housing and for us to create housing in our communities. There was a very big ballot measure 34 years ago, Proposition U. You may have heard of a group called Save the City that has been going around. Is it Save the City? Shoot, I apologize if I got that wrong. If someone knows it and puts it in the chat, please do. I shouldn't riff sometimes when I don't have it in my notes right in front of me. But it's a group that advocated largely for downzoning all of our corridors. So all of our commercial corridors, Santa Monica Boulevard, Ventura Boulevard, Venice Boulevard, La Brea, they used to allow what they call 3-to-1 floor to area ratio. So for every square foot of land, you could build 3 square feet of property, of building. Prop U downzoned that all to 1.5 to 1. And the way that you don't necessarily have to know the technical jargon to see the effect of it, which is strip malls everywhere, because you can't build more densely than that in LA because of this measure that passed in 1986. The first real significant change that we saw at the city of LA was Measure JJJ in 2016, and specifically the transit-oriented communities guidelines that came out of that ballot measure that the Planning Commission approved a couple years ago. Those guidelines allow for increased density in areas that are transit oriented, so long as that housing development provides some percentage of low income affordable housing. Whether it's extremely low income, all these terms have very specific meanings, but they have to provide some percentage, and then they get a number of benefits as a result of that. There has been state legislation that existed prior to 2016 that allowed for a similar kind of thing, but the measure JJJ that we passed in the city of LA is significantly more generous in terms of what it allows for new housing to be built and increased density and heights and all that than the state law was. And so this has actually become now one of the most successful tools in just a few years for creating new affordable housing in the city of LA. And not just for creating new affordable housing, but all through private resources. That we've seen proposed, I think, over 3,500 new affordable units in just 2.5 years with these guidelines. So it's a pretty significant impact. Now, granted, we're in a region that the state has deemed needs 500,000 affordable homes just for the people who already live here. So 3,500 is a drop in the bucket, but it's also more than zero. And frankly, when we're only building, somewhere between 12 and 15,000 homes a year in the city of LA, it's still a significant number. So it is what it is, but it's the biggest change we've seen in our zoning in the last number of decades to actually increase the amount of housing we can build. So here's a chart that was put together a couple of years ago from someone at UCLA. It was essentially all that downzoning I talked about. Here's what it looks like on a chart, which is that back in 1960, when we still had redlining, right? When we still determined where people could live based explicitly on their race or ethnicity, we actually had zoned capacity. You could, if you built out every single parcel to as much housing as you could put on it, we had zone capacity in our city, which had 2.5 million residents, for 4 times that, for 10 million residents. But turns out, right around, you can see it drops fairly quickly to 1970 and continues to drop pretty quickly down to 1990. Once we sort of got rid of redlining, we implemented all these policies, and the net effect of all those policies is to make it so that there's just enough zoned capacity for the number of people who actually live here. And we've slowly ticked that up in the Hollywood community plan, around Koreatown, North Hollywood. You can see these neighborhoods when you think about them in the city of LA, because they are so distinctly more dense than the rest of the city, because we've explicitly allowed more housing to get built in these smaller communities across the city. Just to drive the point home a little bit further, this is something that came out a couple of years ago, but this is the housing units by the year they are built that existed in the city of LA in 2016. Little over 300,000 homes had been built prior to 1939 or earlier. But it's just to show by decade how much housing has been getting built. And you can see that in the last few decades, it's not been much. And that bar for 2010, if you extended it all to 2019, would still be the smallest of any on the chart. So I'm going to just go through this relatively quickly here, but this is essentially to show across the entire Southern California region where we've allowed housing to get built by 20-year span. So there's 1940 to 60, 60 to 80 is going to be the next slide, 80 to 2000 is the next, and then 2000 to 2020. And you'll see in this, just sort of graphically, if you think that I think graphically, that's why I'm offering this, but sort of what the net effect has been of housing policy changes. There's 4 colors on the map. There's red for areas where we've allowed large buildings, 50 or more units, or where we're seeing them getting built, I should say. There's this orangish color for buildings that are medium size, so 2 to 49 units. The light blue is single family homes, and the dark blue is no construction. So from 1940 to 1960, lots of single family homes. Central LA seeing a fair amount of moderate sized structures, and then downtown LA, north of LAX, Westchester area, and UCLA seeing the 50+ unit structures as being built in their communities. As we move on to the next 20-year span, you'll see a lot more of these 2 to 4 unit structures, 1960, 1980. You start dark blues popping up, and you see those. I'll go back one slide. You start to see the light blues spreading out, and they're primarily spreading out on the freeway network that we've just built. Moving forward to 1980 to 2000, now you're seeing much more dark blue. You're also seeing a lot more of these, the dark reds, sort of popping up all over. But you're seeing a lot more of the dark blue, and the light blue is extending out further and further along the freeway network. So a lot of more single family communities being built out along the freeway network. And these dark red communities, you see them in Orange County, more along LAX Westchester area, and in downtown LA. So I'll go back quickly to the previous slide so you can see again how that's changing. So there's the much more light blue, and then turns out got a lot more of almost no construction. And then moving out to this last 20 years, dark blue everywhere. You'll note again, or I'll note that the light blue is really what's converting to dark blue, because once you've built out single family, you've built out single family. There's not more parcels available for single family in an area that's a subdivision that's already been built out for single family. So really what this shows is that over time, we built out the single family, sort of filled in the space, and said, oh, okay, no more new construction in almost any of that. And then that forces the continued growth of the region into a smaller and smaller area. So that's why you're seeing sort of even more red, because we're now seeing these sort of what I might call, like a superstructure apartment complexes versus much smaller, what we call missing middle density kind of, a fourplex or a sixplex or whatever in a community where you've got single family homes and twoplexes and fiveplexes and whatever. We're seeing a lot less of those, 2 to 49 unit structures, and more in smaller areas of these really big structures, and then very little anywhere else. This is essentially just sort of spelling all that out again, so I won't go through this slide. This is a little confusing, but what this is essentially saying is that, and I unfortunately cannot see the slide because I've got this box. There we go. Okay. So if you look at the LA region, if you look at all of our housing in the LA region, 8% of them are 2 to 4 unit, and 10% are 50 or more unit buildings. But if you look at the type of housing built in the last 20 years, only 4% are 2 to 4 unit buildings, and 21% are 50 unit buildings. So in other words, even though regionally we've got these shares of this kind of housing, more recently, we're building a lot less of the smaller housing, the 2 to 4 units, and a lot more of these really big apartment buildings. So people see cranes popping up in Koreatown and downtown and Hollywood, or wherever, and they think we're building so much housing, but the reality is we're not building a whole lot of housing anywhere else. So that is very much why we're finding ourselves in this pickle right now as far as our housing crisis. One other thing I just want to note about housing, we hear some, a lot of times people say, well, new housing is luxury housing, right? Because it's billed as market rate, and oh, by the way, the market's incredibly expensive right now. So we associate that as luxury. If you look at, however, in that chart on the bottom, the percent of total homes built in our region before 1960 is 48%. And built since 2006 is 4%. If you look at the percent of homes that are worth more than $1 million, 50% were built before 1960, and 6% since 2006. And that's essentially to say what I just said a moment ago, which is housing is expensive, period, end of story. It's not really necessarily representative of when it was built, and new housing is not necessarily luxury housing, but it may be expensive because housing is expensive right now. All right, I'm gonna try and pull this. Sorry, I'm futzing with my windows here oh, okay. Okay. So there was a question earlier about downtown, and we'll start to get to this a little bit, but downtown accounts for 1% of City of LA's land area, but 20% of all the new housing built from 1999 to 2015. That trend has been strengthening in the past 5 years. And since 2018, downtown LA has built half of all LA's new homes, and their rents have increased only 1%, while the rest of the city's average about an 8% rent increase. Now, that's not to say that that's just because downtown LA is building so much housing, but it is to say that there's a lot more competition among people trying to offer apartments in downtown LA than there is elsewhere in the city. So if you are a prospective renter, you have a lot more choices in downtown. Now, I'm not necessarily saying they're more affordable, but you have a lot more choices. And that makes you as a renter more able to have agency in that process than if you're trying to live in, say, in Westwood, and not Westwood, that's not a great example, but in Palms, and there's some choices, but not nearly as many. And so landlords can kind of be a little more picky or push the rents up a little more because they get to set the price a little more easily in that environment. So I want to say a little bit about homelessness. This is something I added to the presentation, and I'm sorry if it's a little awkward, but I added it because we get a lot of questions about it, and I wanted to make sure that we talk about it frankly. So we do a homeless count in LA every year. We just did it in January. And you'll see here from that chart, it looks like we had more homeless in 2005 than we do now in LA County. But I do note here, there are big asterisks attached to that number. And the reality is that we probably have significantly more homeless today than we did 15 years ago. But because of the way we do our count, and I noted here that they tried to count people who were in areas that were harder to access by volunteers, because the homeless count that we do every year in LA County, we do with volunteers. So the question, why do we bother with the count? Because federal money is attached to it. That's why we bother with the count. Because in order for us to receive resources, we have to do this, and we have to be able to demonstrate the need. That's why we do this, and that's where we are today on this. But even with those caveats, from 18 to 19, our countywide count increased 12%. In the city, the count, I want to say, went up 18%. And this isn't like there's, 50, it's not like we went from 53 to 59,000 people experiencing homelessness in the county in a single year, and that's people became homeless. Actually, 49,000 people got housing that time, but 55,000 became newly homeless. So there's sort of a churn. And the main cause for this that's been identified in academic papers as to why we have a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis in LA County is housing affordability. It's for every person who becomes homeless, who falls into a place of experiencing homelessness, there's probably another 10 people who are what we might call housing insecure, who are rent paycheck to paycheck, who are paying 50 to 60%, maybe more, of their income just on rent. And all it takes is a COVID-19 crisis. I mean, just that was not part of this presentation 2 months ago, but all it takes is something like this moment in time. Suddenly that house becomes utterly unaffordable, and that person is no longer able to pay the rent to keep the roof over their head. And so that's why we're in this crisis. And the other thing I note in here, because you'll hear people say, oh, well, there's a lot of people coming to LA who are homeless. But actually, the vast majority of the people who are homeless in LA County lived in LA County when they had a home. 2/3 of our homeless in LA County have lived here for more than 10 years. So this is not people who are coming here from somewhere else. This is people who are here, who live here and have lived here for a long time and call LA home. It's just they don't have a roof over their heads as a home. The other thing that we hear is this discussion around mental illness or substance abuse. the percentages of people experiencing homelessness who are coping with either mental illness or substance abuse are not, they're higher than the housed community, but not by a lot. And frankly, one could argue, and I've seen this argued in public health discussions, that just the act of having a house is the only difference. That if you had a home, you would be able to cope more effectively with that mental illness or that whatever that substance issue was. And so, you know, some people think, well, we'll say, you know, the homeless, like they'll say something about, you know, these people are homeless because they're schizophrenic or whatever. Schizophrenia happens across, doesn't matter if you have a house or you don't, but it becomes much more difficult to treat if you don't have a home. Let's see here, a question about how do we know that 55,000 became newly homeless? That's a great question. I don't have the answer for you. That is part of the analysis. So the count happens in January. The numbers are released several months later. So we haven't yet gotten the numbers for the 2020 count conducted this January. I would expect that public health and Department of Social Services have a way of determining that number. And I honestly don't have the answer for you, and I'm sorry. I will make a note of that and find out what I can for that, for your question, Jeremy. Okay, so the University of Southern California did a survey this year of Californians to just find out a little bit more about how their perceptions of homelessness. And I think what's fascinating to me about this is this number that 27% of Californians personally know someone who's homeless. 27%. You know, the number of homeless folks, I mean, if you have 55,000 LA County, it's a county of 10 million residents. So 55,000 is 0.5%, but yet 27% of Californians know someone who's homeless. What's also interesting is this sort of contradiction between the majority of people supporting creating more parking for RVs in public areas, but also the majority of people supporting restricting sleeping tents in public. We're seeing this play out right now in this whole COVID crisis, where cities are trying to create safe spaces for people who are experiencing homelessness to either put a tent if that's what they have, or to park an RV if they have that. And communities who are the housed homeowners, especially in communities, strongly opposing these things because of their stated concerns around, you know, we don't want people bringing this disease or whatever to their community. But let's be honest, even if this disease wasn't happening, if the cities were trying to do this outside of the space around COVID-19, we would still be seeing and have seen these objections. The city of LA has been working to set up safe parking in locations across the city, which is essentially parking lots where people can apply, who are experiencing homelessness, people can apply to park an RV overnight, where they'll have access to a restroom and a shower. They have access to services if those are, if there's anything that they need. And there are often community objections to safe parking being implemented in their communities. So this is a very hot button issue. So that's what I offer here on homelessness. And I just sort of want to drive home this point that the LAO offered in their report that I referenced at the start of the presentation, that they said building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. And if you look at this chart here on the left, California has typically had higher housing prices than the rest of the country, by some amount, by an order of magnitude, not a huge number, but by some number. That really decoupled in the 80s and 90s, where our housing prices just skyrocketed relative to the rest of the country. And I note that because it was around then that our housing capacity, certainly in the city of LA, we downzoned to the point where our zone capacity essentially was matched up with our actual population, and it became inordinately difficult to build new housing. So what can we do? And I know I said this would be an hour, and it's already an hour 20, so I'm moving along here. Can't have a housing crisis if you build more houses. It's kind of our position. So there are a few things that we look at here. One of the first things that we really want to highlight is tenant protections. And a lot of times when people who will describe themselves as YIMBY, yes in my backyard, when they talk about new housing, it'll be sort of devoid of sort of the impacts of people who already live in a community. Sort of like, we just need to build new housing, and even if it means demolishing this building for everyone. Well, and that may actually be true separate from the actual individual impacts that we see that could result from that policy. So for us, we want to make clear up front, tenant protections are mission critical. People who are the most housing vulnerable need to have the most protection to be able to stay in their homes, to be able to have a home that they can afford. And we're seeing that obviously play out right now. A lot of people are very, very challenged in this moment, and seeing the housing insecurity that they've been grappling with really kind of blow up as millions are out of work and unable to pay their rent. So for us, just cause, eviction, and right to counsel are two key tenant protections that we've highlighted and we work on in coalition with other organizations across the region. The next big thing for us is upzoning. And I mentioned the transit-oriented communities program a couple slides back. That's a City of LA program, and referencing back that other slide that I had of all of the different cities and subregions and whatever across the county of LA, just because the City of LA is doing it doesn't mean everyone else is. And even if the City of LA is doing it, doesn't mean the City of LA is even doing it necessarily as good as it could. So we really want to sort of broadly promote the ability of new housing to be built around transit and near jobs. Part of how that happens is what we call density bonuses, where if a developer will provide a certain percentage of low-income housing, they are given bonuses to build taller or closer to the sidewalk or more units overall, or whatever the case may be. So that is a policy that has had some success. Certainly the Transit-Oriented Communities program is an example of that. Key to all of this is what we call addressing CEQA abuse. CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. It's been in place now for 50 years almost. And it was the state's effort to really get its hands around what it saw as the environmental crises around air quality, water quality, and impacts to communities around noise, dust, etc. And so CEQA has been the law of the land for a very long time, determining how the build grows over time. And one of the key things around CEQA has been its calculation around traffic impacts. And that calculation for ever since the existence of CEQA until this year, that calculation has incentivized building housing further and further out on the fringes. So the California Environmental Quality Act has been almost singularly one of the most important pieces of legislation in encouraging urban sprawl in the state of California. And how that plays out is, let's say a developer says, I want to build, 100 units in this city environment. Well, turns out that you want to put that in an environment which already has, that has traffic impacts because, oh, by the way, it's in a city where people want to be, and there's a lot going on. That California Environmental Quality, CEQA, used to track that the impact on cars only. And it would say, okay, well, there's already such bad traffic here. You putting that building there is going to make traffic worse. Doesn't matter what you do, it's going to make it worse. But if you put it way the heck out on the fringes, the traffic's not bad. It's not going to have that much an impact. It's fine. That measure has been flipped on its head in the last year, and cities are actually right now still in the process of implementing or approving new ordinances to comply with a new state requirement. They've actually, because of the whole COVID-19 crisis, they're actually having to postpone in many cities approving these ordinances to change this. So that's having an unfortunate impact on our ability to address CEQA abuse. But cities are having to move to a measure that is much more people-oriented and much less auto-oriented, which changes this equation on its head and actually incentivizes housing being built in the city urban environment and less on the urban fringe. Parking is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart. I wrote my master's thesis on the price effects of parking requirements on housing prices. It turns out that they're incredible. They are parking has an incredible amount of effect on housing affordability. In many places, we require almost as much space to be built for parking as for the accompanying use. For many apartments, depending on the city, they'll require 2 or 3 or 4 parking spaces, depending on the size of the apartment building. When a parking space consumes about 300 square feet, including all the access to it and everything per space, if you add up 3 parking spaces for an apartment, that's 900 square feet for maybe a 2-bedroom apartment, depending on the city. And a 2-bedroom apartment might be 1,000 square feet. You do the math. This is something that adds a great deal of cost to new housing. And the thing that I would note in all of this is that those parking requirements are based literally on nothing. And I will say it again, they're based on nothing. Parking requirements are the most pseudoscience thing you will see. They are, if you ask a member of the community, well, how much parking should this need? It's always more. There's always never enough parking. If you ask someone at the city, they might say, well, we do it because we have this, that, or other thing, but there's not actually a data point that they can point to. And oftentimes what you'll see, especially in newer developments in like Hollywood or Koreatown, these massive parking structures, right? Like Koreatown at Wilshire, Vermont, there's a building that went up about 5 years ago that is 8 or 10 stories of parking garage with a couple apartment towers on top of that. That parking garage is never full, never. And it is probably averaging about 2/3 capacity of usage, because that's sort of the citywide average. That's pretty standard for these big apartment complexes. But does the city change the rules around it? No. Why? Because it's politically one of the most difficult conversations to engage in. The city of LA is preparing to remove parking requirements in downtown, and even that is considered a big lift. So imagine trying to do that in any other community across the city, let alone any other city. It's just not a very popular thing, but it is a very important thing when it comes to addressing housing affordability, because these add a lot of cost to buildings. And if anyone wants to talk about that offline, I'm happy to do that, or ask questions about it. We have a little time. I'm happy to chat a little more about it. Finally, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which we have here abbreviated as RHNA. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment is something that cities have done for decades, but no one really cared about it or paid much attention to it because it didn't mean a whole lot. It was just saying, oh, well, we need this many percent, we need this many new units of affordable housing, extremely low income housing, market rate housing. And then 8 years later, they would say, well, here's what we built. And then they would redo the whole thing all over again. Well, a couple of years ago, a state senator by the name of Scott Wiener passed a bill, SB 35, that said, hey, cities, if you're not meeting your RHNA requirements, you actually are required to permit new housing that helps you meet that while we're still in that 8-year window that we have. Every 8 years, they sort of refresh the RHNA numbers. Well, this got cities dander all up, right? Because I think it was 97% of cities in the first year of this bill, 97% were out of compliance, which meant that in the time they were out of compliance, if a developer came forward and said, I want to build X number percent of affordable housing units as part of a larger project that's X number total number of units, the city had to say, go for it, because we are out of compliance. Well, that put an inordinate amount of pressure on the whole RHNA process, And so then, of course, cities wanted to say, okay, we're only going to build, we only have to build so many new units of housing. And so then the subsequent bill that Senator Wiener pushed through at the state level said, and you don't get to play around with the numbers. You actually have to put forward real numbers on a certain number of metrics. And in this last year in the Southern California, especially through the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, there's been a whole process that Abundant Housing LA has been very active with, and frankly has been very successful with, in ensuring that largely the coastal urban cities, which SCAG includes a lot of rural inland cities as well, but that the coastal urban cities have to carry a much larger share of the housing burden for our region through the RHNA process than they wanted to originally. That they actually were, the city of LA over the next 8 years has to provide zone capacity to increase number of homes in the entire city by about 450,000 over 8 years. Think about that in a city that's, right now, if we were really, really pushing it, we'd be doing 15,000 a year. 15,000 a year over 8 years is 120,000 units. But now, because of the RHNA rules that have been put in place, the city of LA has got to increase the zone capacity to do 4 times that over the next 8 years, just the city of LA. But this is also because it's regional. This is happening across all of our coastal urban cities. They're having to figure out how are we going to improve our zoning capacity, our zone capacity for new housing, so that we can actually provide the amount of new housing that this process requires us to do. And so if you don't live in the city of LA, but you live in Burbank or Santa Monica or Long Beach or Carson or wherever, your city is going through a process right now to determine how it's going to be able to demonstrate that it can provide that much zone capacity for new housing. So this RHNA process is playing out right now, even in the midst of this public health crisis. So if you want to get more involved, this is one way to help advocate around this process for your city. So that leads us into what can you do. It used to all be public meetings where you had to go to them in person, and now we can just Zoom for the however long. We'll see. And if you like meetings, you're probably just as crazy as this guy. I'm not a big fan of meetings myself, but that's what we do. It's important. So most housing projects that are significant will have some amount of hearings on them. Even if they don't have some big public hearing, you can still write to your elected official, to the zoning office, wherever, and say you support a project. Or you can even write to the developer and find out, if there are ways they can improve it in your eyes to make it a more successful project. But you just get involved. This is all very publicly done. And then the other thing we note here is joining Abundant Housing LA if you aren't already a member, which includes being a member, donating, following us on all these social media sites. And then also we have something called being a project volunteer, Abundant Housing LA project volunteer. And I just want to say a little bit about this because I think this is a really, really important thing in all of this. Project volunteers very specifically are monitoring City Planning Commission agendas, writing letters of support, and speaking in support of housing at city and neighborhood council meetings. City of LA has 100 neighborhood councils. So that's a really important way to get involved. And I'm sorry, I'm just got distracted because I got a question. How do you use 10 neighborhood councils? I understand excellent zoning. So I'll speak about neighborhood councils in just a moment as a former president of my neighborhood council. The time commitment we ask for project volunteers is about 2 to 5 hours a week. Mostly at your computer, which is for many of us the truth of just generally life right now is mostly at our computers. And city hearings are at the moment not at their city halls. They're happening virtually. Same with neighborhood council meetings. That will obviously change at some point into some other form of these meetings. But in the meantime, just being sort of on top of things and engaging in some manner is really, really important. So as a former neighborhood council president in the Los Feliz neighborhood council, I can say that neighborhood councils functionally have no specific authority. However, if a neighborhood council has their hearing on a project and they write a letter of support, that project is very, very likely to be okay. It's very, very likely to move through the process with the support of the City Planning Commission and the City Council. Neighborhood councils often gain their greatest leverage by requesting some amount of concessions, right? So they'll say, we want you to provide additional street trees, or we want you to set back part of the building on this corner further from where it is currently, or we want you to increase the number of affordable housing units by whatever number. So they'll have things that they'll talk about when they have hearings with the developer, that they'll say, look, we'll offer our conditional support if you do A, B, C, and D, whatever those things may be. And so what I have found is developers will want to try and work with a neighborhood council if they feel like there is a place to get to yes. If they feel like there is a place where they can get to, where they can say, look, we are going to do the things you've asked us to do, and in exchange for your support. I mean, it sounds very transactional, and it is, but it also means that from the neighborhood council, they're able to provide some kind of good for the community. They're able to, as operating as the voice of the community, ensure that whatever is happening in the community is reflective of, is responsive to community needs and community issues. So that is where sort of neighborhood councils play their strongest role. Now, some neighborhood councils will just say no. They'll just say, we don't want it to change, we don't like it, whatever the case may be. I'm not entirely sure how effective those neighborhood councils are in their ability to shape housing policy, especially if they're known by City Planning Commission members and City Council members as just being the nose in the room. Then they probably, it diminishes their ability to affect the process. Some are more effective than others, especially if they have very litigious members who are willing to take housing projects to court and argue in that venue. But all of that said, neighborhood councils have a good role process, and frankly, I think by their nature tend to attract a lot of folks who just want to say no to things. And when you get people who come and say, look, this community is important to me because it offers me the ability to, raise my kid, to access my job without having to drive there, to be able to, whatever the case may be, take care of my ailing parent. And I really want other people to have that opportunity. And so I support this project. Having even just one of those voices in the room makes a huge difference for the people who are making the decision by the neighborhood council, either at the committee or the full board level, because they so rarely do hear those voices. And so starting to hear those voices has a big impact for them. Am I aware of any YIMBY neighborhood councils, or that aren't entirely NIMBY? Yes. And what I will say is that sort of YIMBY NIMBY idea, the NIMBY being no in my backyard and YIMBY being yes in my backyard, it tends to be a little more nuanced than that at a neighborhood council. I mean, just in general, it tends to be more nuanced than that. But you'll find people who really want to see more affordable housing, who maybe would generally not like to see at a 100% market rate development. But if there was affordable housing in a project, would be, even if it was just a certain percent, would be very supportive. You'll see people who would generally like more housing, but would be opposed to like a project that proposes to demolish an 8-unit building to build a 12-unit building, especially if the 8-unit building is rent stabilized homes. So the NIMBY YIMBY thing can be a bit of a red herring, I think, in any context, but also at neighborhood councils. That said, there are certainly neighborhood councils that have a reputation for just saying no to everything, and some neighborhood councils that have a reputation for being much more receptive to new housing getting constructed in their boundaries, and then a number that are kind of sort of in different places about depending on the project or the location or context. So we really do want people to get involved, however you feel comfortable getting involved, and project volunteering is one way that we really find is a great way to do that. So that's my presentation, and I offer you my email here, as well as my Twitter handle and my Facebook, in case you would like to reach out to me and chat at any point. We got a couple minutes here in case anyone has any questions you had. So I will just take a moment and let you ask any questions you have, and I'm happy to answer. Great. Thank you for your question, Winston. So the question is about my take on the expansion of rent stabilization ordinances, Costa-Hawkins, Ellis Act reform or repeal. So obviously, Winston, you've done your homework and you know about some of the state bills. Thank you. So the Costa-Hawkins is the state bill passed in the 90s, which was essentially to stop the ability of cities to do more rent stabilization across the state. It locked in place rent stabilization eligible properties to properties built prior to when the bill became law. Ellis Act is a bill that allows for eviction of tenants from a building in the event that the owner wishes to convert, I'm doing air quotes here, convert it to a owner occupied, so condominiums. So I think that rent stabilization is a good thing. I have seen how it provides for people the ability to stay safe and secure in their home. And more than anything, homes should be a place where people feel safe. And the insecurity associated with not knowing from year to year if you're going to be able to afford to live in your home while your income remains fairly constant, and other things in your life sort of change in terms of, you know, costs associated with your healthcare or anything with your family or whatever. Rent stabilization provides a certainty or a level of certainty, a degree of certainty for people who are renters that I think is really, really important. Where I have concerns about some of these measures is if they get implemented in a way that has the effect of stopping the creation of new housing. And what we would expect, for instance, in a community, if we were to say, you can apply rent stabilization statewide and do strict rent control so that buildings can't see their rents go up, no matter if there's turnover or anything, with what we call vacancy control. If you were to say, you know, that cities could do this writ large for any building built whenever, it doesn't matter. My concern would be that some cities would say, oh, okay, well, all new buildings are subject to vacancy control, strict vacancy control from the moment they open, any building over X number of units. And then, surprise, surprise, we'd see no new buildings getting built in those cities that implement these policies, which probably was the intention behind the policies, even if that wasn't the stated intent, even if the stated intent was, we just want to make sure housing's affordable. But, oh, guess what? When you're not building any more new housing because it doesn't pencil anymore to build new housing, the housing you have there that does exist is probably now becoming inordinately unaffordable anyway. So I think there's a balance that has to be struck, but I do think it's possible. For instance, I've seen the idea of like a rolling rent control so that buildings that are older than, say, 20 or 30 years would then qualify to be now rent controlled or rent stabilized, so that in 2020, anything built before, let's say, 1990 is now rent stabilized. And in 2025, anything built before 1995 is now rent stabilized. Because part of what we're seeing right now in the way that we implement rent stabilization and rent control in the state of California is primarily it's buildings built before, I want to say, 1978 in the cities of LA and San Francisco and a couple others, I think Berkeley, Oakland, I think, and one or two others. There, obviously, you can't build any more buildings today that were built before that, right? So the number of rent stabilized units as it is today is the highest it's ever going to be, and it'll be less tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. So the way our laws exist presently, by their nature, they're defending a shrinking pool of available housing units in a state whose population is expanding. So they doesn't make sense. And if your purpose is to provide housing stability for the people who need it in a state whose population is growing, it doesn't make sense to only apply your laws to a shrinking pool of housing units. Said, if you're going to make the laws more dynamic and flexible and sensible to a growing population, you also have to do it in a way that isn't then making it impossible to finance the creation of new housing. So there is some give and take here, but I do think it's possible, and I think it's important. Any other questions? So Winston, you asked about the role that racial covenants during the 1920s had in LA, and that you said that they were prevalent in certain parts of San Francisco and other areas of the US. I will say I'm not as aware, I'm not as familiar with that part of the history. Racial covenants, however, existed then, and in some places they existed not too long ago, and perhaps still exist in places where they're not letting us know, or they're not very public about it, or they're not explicit about it. One of the things that we saw in housing policy from the federal side was that the federal government in the housing that it was building was, and this is something that comes out of a book, Color of Housing, I believe that's what it's called. I'm blanking on it. Color of Law. Thank you, Lenora. Again, I should not just riff off the cuff here, because these things don't come to me quite right all the time. But yes, The Color of Law came out a year ago about all sort of the history of housing as it relates to redlining, especially, and housing discrimination, not necessarily being explicit, but still sort of ingrained into all the policies to actually discriminate very intentionally against people. And the federal government in the teens and 20s, early 20th century, was creating housing where it was essentially going into communities that, in some cases, that were very integrated and doing just fine, that were integrated communities. And it was creating federal housing that it was then limiting to people of different races. And this actually had the net effect of racializing and segregating communities that in some cases were already integrated. So, one of the things that's sort of interesting to me about this is that some of the sort of segregation or sort of distinctions around sort of where sort of there's predominance of different racial and ethnic communities in our cities didn't used to always be the case, and is actually oftentimes a direct result of housing policies and racial covenants that were intended to have this effect and have had this effect. But specifically around racial covenants during the 1920s, what role did they play? I mean, the role they were intended to play. That's what I would say about the role they had. Well, I want to thank all of y'all for being here and participating. I know it's a unique time right now that we're dealing in, and it's also, I think, really important that we are able to kind of look at these issues and think about these issues through a shared lens, understanding the context and the history, and specifically for Abundant Housing LA, our overall theory of change about why this is so important. And our plan, when we first put this all together last year, Leonora, was to do this every other month. But I do think given the accessibility we have through Zoom, maybe we could look at doing something not as laid out as a couple, in June, but maybe something sooner to doing this again. But if you are interested in sharing with anyone else, or you'd like to invite other folks to participate in our next one, please let us know. If you have any feedback for me, I'll send around a survey after this, as well as a PDF of this presentation, so that you can certainly share that with, or you can check that out for yourself and have it available to you. But we're here to be a resource. I'm happy to be a resource however I can, and please encourage you to invite others to be engaged in this conversation as well.